SoundCartel.
In this episode, we're talking to James Cridland, radio futurologist and editor of podnews.net. COVID-19 has kept the perpetually travelling James in Brisbane, where he joins us to talk news, technology, and what he sees ahead for podcasting.
Obviously, everything has suffered during COVID. For podcasting, they predict that the figures will go up by a further 14% this year, so a significant decline in the increase, but it's still increasing. The radio folk that I talk to are seeing drops of 40, 50%. Outdoor is down by 70%. Cinema, which I'm fascinated by, is down by 80%. And I'm there going, where are they still getting the 20% from? Because you can't go to a cinema.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 10 of season 4. And hello once more to producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hi Nick, so good to be back with you again. Really looking forward to hearing James Cridland's thoughts in this episode. But before we get to him, did you see that Spotify has added the ability for some podcasters, just some, to publish video podcasts?
Yes, I did see that, although I haven't actually seen a video working yet on Spotify. But nevertheless, I do believe that some are working.
Yeah.
I think the reason for it may be motivated by the fact that they bought Joe Rogan's podcast, and that was a huge video on YouTube. So we'll see where that goes and how successful it is for Spotify introducing video podcasts. But it does raise a question that I've been wanting to ask you for a while, actually. So let's do it now.
Sure.
Should podcasters that are starting out now make a video version of their podcast?
It's an interesting question, and actually I've been asked it a few times. I think a podcast can be successful with and without video. It shouldn't be something that prejudices a good podcast because you don't have video. I think if you're suited for video, if you're happy to have it on, if you're skilled and can set up video, go for it. But if you're going to go to the effort of pushing video anyway, you'd probably want to do the same thing or do the same thing on a podcast platform. So I'm a little bit on the fence with it. And of course, having multiple mediums and different ways to reach out to audiences is always good. But I think a standalone podcast without video can work just as well as a podcast with audio.
Yeah, it does sort of sound contradictory to be telling people to consider a video podcast when we bang on about how audio is so fantastic because it's engaging and you can multitask it, and completion rates are longer because people can listen while they're doing other things.
Yeah.
And then we say, but go pop it on YouTube as well. But I guess it's because there's a huge audience on YouTube.
Exactly.
If you've already got a following on YouTube, and I've seen this with podcasts where they had built hundreds of thousands of followers to their YouTube channel, then more recently started a podcast, got relatively small numbers in audio-only podcasting land, and so then decided to start adding a video version to their YouTube channel and saw much, much bigger numbers on YouTube. And of course that makes sense. You've got a following. But if you're starting out and you need to build an audience in different ways, because the way you promote an audio podcast will be different to the way you promote a video podcast. So I think probably agreeing with you a little bit, if you're just starting out and you're not a video expert, then the barriers to entry for audio are lower. So it's a great place to start. You can always move to video later.
Absolutely.
And you can do video in more simplified ways, using tools like Headliner to turn your audio podcast into a video, to put it onto YouTube without having to go to the efforts of filming the whole thing and then the editing and all that, which can add many more layers of complication to your post-production process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you can be on YouTube, there's a huge audience. So,
it's massive. Yeah, the YouTube audience is huge. And if you have the capacity, if you have the time, it's time consuming enough to do a podcast, as we all know, audio only. If you've got the time, the capacity, the wherewithal, do it.
Yeah. I hope that answers the question for those that have been asking. But we really should move on to our chat with James Cridland.
Yes.
Now, due to stage 4 lockdown, we have decided to not link 3 bedrooms together to record that interview. So I won the coin toss and connected just my bedroom to James's bedroom in Brisbane. Now, James Cridland has worked in radio since 1989 and is now a writer, consultant, awards judge and public speaker. He also refers to himself as a radio futurologist, and many of you will remember James because this is his third appearance on Podcasting Essentials. He's also the managing editor of podnews.net, which is a daily podcast and newsletter. And he joins us now. Hi, James. Thanks so much for joining us again on Podcasting Essentials.
It's a great pleasure to be asked back. Thank you very much.
Now, usually at this time of year, James, you'd be on the international speaking circuit, gallivanting around the world, talking about the latest podcasting statistics and other things. So perhaps we could start with an update on who's listening and other important podcasting stats.
You know, all of the figures are going up, which is nice. So since we last spoke, Edison Research did a whole new set of data around Australian podcast listening. And that continues to go up. So 25%, a quarter of Australians listen to a podcast every month, which is really good. We're about 3 years behind the US. So the US is around 37%. So here we are on 25%. But even so, that's a pretty good number, I think. And 17% are listening every week. What's interesting to me, and this research was done prior to the pandemic and everything going on, is that most listening is at home, a lot of listening at home, and then cars, walking, and on public transport, buses, trams, trains, that sort of thing. And it's all mobile as well. And we're listening to 6 podcasts a week, which is nice and interesting to find out. The other thing, I suppose, from a business point of view is ad revenue in terms of podcasting. That is also going up. The US figures came out a couple of weeks ago for 2019, and the figures went up by 48%, which was actually more than they thought that the numbers would actually go up. So that's pretty good.
Is that a figure that's during the COVID period as well?
So, obviously everything has suffered during COVID. For podcasting, they predict that the figures will go up by a further 14% this year. So a significant decline in the increase, but it's still increasing. And if you go and you talk to radio broadcasters, TV, and especially outdoor, then they are seeing massive drops. The radio folk that I talk to are seeing drops of 40, 50%. Outdoor is down by 70%. Cinema, which I'm fascinated by, is down by 80%. And I'm there going, where are they still getting the 20% from? Because you can't go to a cinema. But anyway, let's sort of ignore that. But so podcasting did have a little dip during the pandemic, but not that much in terms of consumption, because obviously we can still consume shows wherever we are. And from a revenue point of view, actually, we've not seen too much of a downside, which is nice.
What other trends have you observed in podcasting since we last spoke to you in May 2019?
I think there's been an awful lot of things going on in podcasting. It's been quite an exciting time, really. Obviously, you've got all of the consolidation in the market, particularly Spotify hoovering up all kinds of people, but also SiriusXM, which is a big radio broadcaster in the US, has bought all kinds of bits of podcasting from Stitcher to Simplecast and everybody else. So there's a lot of consolidation going on. The two things that I'm sort of interested in actually are, firstly, a lot of new rankers have appeared. So we have an Australian podcast ranker here that Triton runs. There's one in Latin America. There's a new one in the US. So there are a number of these rankers going on. And there've been rankers in Norway and Sweden and in other places for some time now. So it's very interesting seeing what some of those rankers are telling us in terms of popularity of individual shows, popularity of genres and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of that has been going on. And also an awful lot of work around attribution. And I think this is the thing that I'm most interested in, is seeing how well podcasting works from an advertising point of view, and just the amount of data that we're now able to get out of advertising on podcasts. So that's been very interesting. Both companies like Podsites, Chartable, and there's a bunch of other companies doing this same sort of thing. And I was part of a conference a couple of weeks ago where you could really see just the amount of data that we were collecting and how successful podcast advertising is, which is a great thing.
You mentioned pod sites. They've released quite an enormous amount of data recently.
Yeah, they did. So they had a look back at 1.2 billion ad impressions, which seems an awful lot, $28 million worth of advertising. And they've been able to pull a bunch of data out of that. One of the headline things for me was that embedded ads, so that's host-read ads in the main, they work twice as well as a radio spot which has been thrown into a podcast. So that probably doesn't come as a surprise to those of us who work in podcasting, because we've been saying that for a long, long time. But it's really nice actually seeing the data showing that, yeah, a host-read ad works so much better. So that's been really interesting. And also just sort of seeing the obvious things, which you would kind of expect them to say, that podcast ads convert significantly better than ads on social media and that sort of thing. So, yeah, great amount of information in their conversion benchmark report if you're Googling for it.
Yeah, it's really nice to have the data backing up what we've all been assuming for a number of years. Now, COVID-19 has had an impact on podcasting, obviously along with everything else. But we've seen more podcasts being created than ever before and altered listening habits. What do you see as the positives for our industry moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I do not see any negatives at all. I mean, I think that there's a significant amount of new listening which has happened as a result of this. There's some data that came out of France a couple of weeks ago showing that really the amount of audio listening has gone up considerably since we had lockdown. And so if more people are listening to podcasts as a result of this, then that's good news for us, I think. That's been good. And I think just the amount of growth in the industry, as you say, has also been good. So more podcasts created month on month than ever. It's beginning to slow down a little bit now, but also just the amount of content, the amount of useful information which is now available out there in terms of individual shows. So I probably like you, start the day with listening to Coronacast from the ABC, which is a great non-sensationalized show with useful information about where we're going in terms of the pandemic. So that has been a real boost in terms of mental health, a real boost in terms of knowing what's actually going on. And I think podcasting is very uniquely placed to actually help here.
And something else we've seen increasing demand for more recently is internal or private podcasts, which makes sense, of course. As you said, we're all at home and we need to keep workplaces connected, which is really important right now. And technology is making it even easier now with private podcasting tools, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And we've seen a bunch of companies. So there's a big company in the US called Storyboard, which its essential focus is internal podcasts for companies and for communities. And Castos and Blueberry are also doing internal podcasts as well. And I think it's a nice change from huddling round a Zoom screen, and having a listen to your CEO talking, to actually be able to consume that in your own time is a very useful thing. So a bunch of that beginning to happen. I found it interesting seeing Spotify hiring for people to run their own internal podcasts. And you think, wow, if Spotify think that there's actually jobs here to actually run their own internal shows, then this is certainly a part of the industry that we should be focusing on a little bit more.
Now, sticking on the technology side of things, a year ago you predicted here that there would be a big focus on technology, and you said that this is where the smart money might be. So has technology moved forward as you'd hoped, and what are the benefits for podcasters?
Yeah, I think technology is moving forward in terms of podcasters, but I think it's relatively slow. And one of the difficulties that we have in terms of podcasting is also one of our strengths. We are open. RSS means that anybody can listen to podcasts on any platform. But on the other side, that means that the amount of data, the amount of information about individual shows is actually quite small. And so we haven't seen an awful lot of innovation in terms of how podcasts are consumed. And there are Some companies, Entail is one of them from the UK, who are trying to do additional clever things with augmented images and links and all that kind of stuff as you listen to a show. But that's sort of really adding a Band-Aid onto where we are. So I wonder in the future whether or not companies like Spotify, who are clearly bypassing RSS for their own stuff, I wonder whether they will begin to demand a bit more changes in terms of how podcasts get into their system and whether or not that will actually change where we are as an industry. But at the moment, the amount of technology, the focus on technology has really been at the moment around attribution and around advertising rather than around the user experience, which is still sort of fairly as it was 5-10 years or so ago.
You mentioned Spotify there. I'd like to move to all of the podcast listening app wars. Last time you talked about Google's bold plan to double podcast consumption worldwide within 2 years. Well, time's up, so I'm keen to hear whether they've succeeded. And meanwhile, Spotify was rapidly taking market share away from Apple Podcasts. So who's winning now, and is Apple still the first place you need to be?
I mean, Apple is definitely the first place you need to be, apart from anything else, because it feeds so many other things. So if you're in Apple Podcasts, you are also automatically in places like Overcast and Pocket Casts and so on and so forth. I think it's really interesting that there's a bunch of different data out there that, depending on which data you look at, Spotify's number one, or Apple is number one, or somebody else is number one. Sometimes YouTube is number one for podcast listening, which is very confusing. But the data that I am seeing still seems to point to Apple Podcasts on a global basis, Apple Podcasts doing really well. So the latest data that I have from Libsyn, which is a big American-focused podcast company, and that's worth bearing in mind, Apple is 69% of all downloads. So that's a large number. Spotify is second with 8%. And then you have Overcast and Stitcher and Castbox and all of those sorts of ones, which are less than 2.5 each. So really, it's a two-horse race at the moment. I mean, I've been saying for a long time that I don't think that Apple's place in our industry is very healthy for us. And I think it would be rather more useful if there were three large players, each with about 30% of market share. And currently, Apple, depending on how you look at it, Apple is responsible for about 85% of all podcast listening. And that's not a good place to be, particularly since Apple don't necessarily care about the industry as much as other parties do, because podcasting earns them no money and is a tiny amount of what they do. So I think that's one thing to have a look at. Google Podcasts, I think, has been hampered by the fact that it has stupidly been still running another podcast app, Google Play Music Podcasts, which by all accounts will finally close in October of this year, only 800 days since they launched Google Podcasts as a competitor to it. So hopefully that will go away, and hopefully that will help Google's plans here. But Google has been quite disappointing, I think, in terms of the amount of take-up. It's currently responsible for 1.3%, although, to be honest, it's not very easy to measure. So it may be twice as much as that, but twice as much of nothing is still nothing, really. So that's been a bit disappointing, I think, in terms of the amount of additional ears that Google has got us.
Google are doing other things, though, that are helping with discoverability with Google search results and that sort of stuff. Are there other things that you know of that they're working on that are going to help the industry as a whole, even if the numbers of their actual app don't necessarily increase?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Bear in mind, I think it's 1.2 billion searches are done on Google every second, and increasingly those searches do give you bits of podcasts that you can go and have a listen to. And what may be happening is people may be going, oh, this looks like a good podcast. I'll open Apple Podcasts or Spotify and I'll fire that up and have a listen in there. So that may be going on. Google is also doing some quite clever things in terms of transcriptions, in terms of being able to look a little bit closer into what that podcast is all about. And so hopefully Google will have an effect there. But I'm a big cheerleader for what Google are trying to end up doing, but it's quite sad that they haven't moved the needle as much as anybody wanted, I think.
Yeah. And you mentioned transcripts there. I wanted to move to transcripts because we know they're good for SEO and we all want to increase our chances of being discovered. But you've raised some concerns on Pod News about podcasters having control over their own transcripts. What should podcasters be considering?
Well, two things. I think every podcaster should ideally have a transcript there. And in fact, there's a court case going through the US at the moment in New York where someone is taking Gimlet to court for not putting closed captions, those subtitles that you see on the telly, around their podcasts. Now, in my mind, they've asked for the wrong things. Nobody wants closed captions for podcasts, but everybody would quite like transcripts. And it may well be that the accessibility acts that we have in law actually say that if you do a podcast, you have to have a transcript, which would be scary in some ways because that would increase our workload, but probably the right thing, in other ways. You could also argue that technology can probably fix all of that stuff as well. So that's going on. But I think on a very basic level, having a transcript helps you in terms of SEO, helps people who don't have the time to listen to a 2.5-hour show, but would like to have a quick skim through and see what's interesting and what they can actually pull out of that. That's a very helpful thing. I think where it gets a little bit more murky is when you have other companies doing that for podcasters without their knowledge or consent. And there's a number of different platforms who are publishing transcripts, getting those transcripts about 95% accurate, which means that they're not accurate particularly. And it just means that if you're not careful, you've got inaccurate transcripts going out there of things that I didn't say or things that other people didn't end up saying. And that, to me, sounds like a bit of a recipe for misunderstanding in the future. I wonder whether podcasters, it comes back to the RSS conversation, but I wonder whether podcasters should be having a look at this and going, you as a podcast platform may not make an automated transcript, and instead you should link to mine because mine is the official transcript of my show. And at the moment, that doesn't exist in RSS, and perhaps it should do.
Now, moving along, podcasting news is your thing, being the editor and host of your daily Pod News podcast. And there has been no shortage of news, with Spotify continuing their shopping spree, as well as several other large industry players being purchased, including Serial Productions just recently. So what has stood out for you in podcasting news lately?
I mean, I think, firstly, as you say, the amount of consolidation, the amount of people buying things. But I think on a more general level, the clash between old and new seems to be amplifying itself. So the clash between those people who are there talking about podcasting being the independent voice, being not mass media, but an open product that anybody can use. There is a real clash there between the original old guard and people who are coming into it over the last couple of years going, this is a medium that we can earn money from, and this is a medium that we can help push more cash into and more advertiser dollars. And there's a real clash going on there. And I think it's quite interesting. I was at Podcast Movement in February in LA, and there was a real undercurrent of hostility on both sides. One of the things that's probably going to help with that is the Podcast Academy, which is this large organization in the US, or hopefully going to be a large organization in the US, which has a bunch of the new folk in there, also has a bunch of old heritage podcasters who are also part of that organization. And hopefully that should mean that people start talking to one another and working together as one industry again. But that is, I think, been the main thing that I've spotted over the last 5 or 6 months, certainly, is just that clash of old and new.
We actually spoke to the chair of the Podcast Academy, Rob Greenlee, on a recent episode. So if people want to go back and have a listen, it is interesting to see what they're doing. Not the great time to be launching an academy, but for the long term, hopefully they can make this one stick and do some good work.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And it is definitely a worthwhile thing. We need particularly work around best practices so that talking about transcripts, talking about all kinds of other things. And I think that would really help us, just the entire industry talking together as one.
Yeah, I agree. This is your third appearance on Podcasting Essentials, and we've never asked you about how you produce your own podcast. First, I know you are very shy about self-promotion. So, James, can you tell us where we can find your podcast?
Well, you should be getting my newsletter, which is an email newsletter which comes out every day. You can subscribe to that for free at podnews.net. And as part of that, there is also a podcast, partially because people, every time I talked about, I write about podcasting, they said, and do you have a podcast of your own? And I kept on saying, well, no, not really, but I kind of ought to. But actually, it's a very useful thing. So you'll find it, obviously, everywhere that you can get podcasts and quite a few places that you possibly shouldn't. It's called Pod News, Podcasting News.
Very good. Now, a daily podcast is no mean feat. How do you do all the research and produce a podcast every day? Is there a team of hundreds helping you?
I wish that would be brilliant. And occasionally I get emails saying, please thank you and all of the rest of your team. And to which I always reply and say, I will hire a team and then thank them for you. The primary thing that I produce is that newsletter that comes out every day. It's a bunch of links to news about the industry. And although I can put it together in about an hour from sitting down to having a finished newsletter and podcast, I would rather spend a little bit longer on it. But I end up reading a bunch of RSS feeds, Facebook groups, Reddit, all kinds of other places, finding what's going on, and also getting an awful lot of email from folks wanting to tell me what's happening as well.
I suppose being stuck in your hometown in Queensland is probably making it a little bit easier to record at the moment. You're not in airport lounges and by the side of the road.
Well, yes, although, to be honest, I do the podcast partially for some really helpful research and understanding of all of the different platforms out there. I also self-host that show myself as well, so I get all of the technology stuff done, so I can actually see what each individual host is doing, which is really interesting. But also, I rather enjoy doing it. My background is radio. I used to be behind a microphone every day for a number of hours, so it's quite nice being behind a microphone for a number of minutes and putting something together. Sure, it's easier because I'm stuck in my home office most of the time, but actually it doesn't make much difference whether or not I'm at home or, as you say, in a hotel room somewhere or in an airport lounge. All I need is a microphone and a computer, and that's literally it. So it's really easy.
Now, final question, James. It's crystal ball time again. A year ago, you told Chris Ashmore and me that you expected large growth in listenership in countries like India, which we've definitely seen. So again, what lies ahead for the next year?
I think, so I've got four things. I will quickly ramp through those. Firstly, a really interesting stat that there were more new shows in non-English language than there were in English language last quarter in terms of the world. That is a really interesting stat, and I think it shows that we will continue to see a large amount of growth from countries outside of the US and Australia and the UK, so that's well worth keeping a look at. Spotify will continue to grow. I predict trouble ahead with Joe Rogan. I suspect that he will get Spotify into all manner of trouble with some of the guests that he has had on, some of the guests that he will have, some of the ridiculous things that he's saying. I mean, he's saying all kinds of things about COVID-19, amplifying conspiracy theories. He has known anti-Semites on his show. To be honest, it's a pretty dreadful show, and I suspect that Spotify will get shouted at, prolonged shouting for a long time about why you are allowing this guy on the air. So that'll be interesting.
Why have they then? Why would they open that Pandora's box on themselves?
Why would they? Because it's the number one show. It's the number one podcast in the world by any stretch of the imagination. And I think this has also been missed by quite a lot of the press, is that it's also a really big show on YouTube as well. And Google is currently closing down Google Play Music and shifting everybody over to YouTube Music, which is a competitor to Spotify, and actually quite a worthy one in that it's got all of YouTube in there as well. It's got video as well as audio. That's actually quite a competitor to Spotify. So you can see them going, well, we'll have Joe Rogan because he's really big on YouTube as well as being really big in terms of podcasting as well. But I think it's going to bite them. I really do. So I certainly see that going on. I see Apple maybe sitting up and paying attention to this podcasting thing in the future. That said, I think we've probably thought that over the last 5 years, and Apple are still asleep at the wheel, sadly. But I also think that we will see different support models for podcasting begin to appear. We're very focused on advertising. There are more and more companies, yours included, who are doing stories with brands, which is a very nice, different way of funding great stories. But I suspect that we'll also see a bunch of other support models in the future as well. And potentially Apple has a part to play in that too. It wouldn't surprise me if this time next year we were talking about there being a fee to be listed in Apple Podcasts. But on the other side, Apple Podcasts actually making it possible for you to sell access to your show, for you to be able to buy the next season of this show for just $2 or $3. So it wouldn't surprise me that that would actually happen. It'll be an interesting time, I'm sure.
Yeah, very interesting thoughts on Apple. I mean, it's something we've, like you said, been discussing for years. So maybe this will be the year. We'll have to check back in, hopefully in less than a year, but we'll definitely check in again soon. Thank you so much, James, for joining us again on Podcasting Essentials. Take care.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks so much for asking me.
It's always terrific to hear from James, and I actually agree with you, Nick, that it'll be interesting to see if Apple does step up and change the status quo or just rolls on as they are.
Time will tell.
The other interesting point James made was ad revenue being up by 48% in the US for 2019, and that during COVID they're expecting an additional 14%, which is in stark contrast to some of the other mediums that are seeing a sharp decline in ad revenue.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that COVID doesn't seem to have really negatively affected podcasting. In fact, in many ways, podcasting has been good. It's been a good time for podcasting.
It has. It's definitely grown listenership in the numbers of people that are producing podcasts, absolutely. I think also because podcasts can be consumed wherever you are. Unlike other mediums where you have to be in specific places or doing certain things, there's kind of no wonder that ad revenue has dropped off. But podcasting does seem to have held its own during this crisis.
And found opportunities like with internal podcasts that we spoke to James about. That's an area that is on the increase because of COVID-19 in many ways.
Yeah.
And we're actually producing a couple ourselves at the moment for clients that are using podcasting to communicate internally to their staff. And as James said, it's much better than sitting around the Zoom screen.
So much better. We're all getting Zoom fatigue. And,
We are.
And we're already there. With so many people listening, they're on their podcast apps, they're consuming content that way anyway. Just give them another way that's enjoyable to consume work-related content.
And being on demand. So particularly with
Exactly.
strange working hours now, most people working from home, podcasting is perfect.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, I think that's about all we have time for on this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
No worries, always a pleasure.
And to find out more about how we can help you create a podcast, check out our website at soundcartel.com.au or on the socials at SoundCartelAU. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening now. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.